Mark Stevens stared through the thick glass window of the space station, watching Earth grow smaller as the transport ship carried him toward his new home. Even after 6 months since Earth joined the Galactic Federation, seeing his home planet from space still filled him with wonder. Attention all passengers, we are approaching Research Station Delta. Please prepare for docking procedures, the ship's AI announced in multiple languages. Mark gathered his belongings, double-checking that his research equipment was secure. As one of Earth's top xenobiologists, he had been selected for a prestigious position studying dangerous alien species. The fact that humans were chosen for such sensitive work so soon after joining the Federation showed how much faith they had in Earth's scientists. The docking procedure went smoothly, and Mark stepped onto the station for the first time. The air had a slightly metallic taste, and the gravity felt a bit lighter than Earth's. Aliens of various species walked past him, some floating, others crawling, and a few rolling on wheel-like appendages. A tall, blue-skinned alien with 4 arms approached him. "Dr. Stevens, I am Director Blue. Welcome to Research Station Delta." The universal translator made their conversation effortless. "Please follow me for your orientation." As they walked through the station's corridors, Director Blue explained the basic rules and safety protocols. Mark noticed how other researchers moved aside when they passed, showing great respect for the director. They entered a secure briefing room, and Director Blue's friendly demeanor changed. "Dr. Stevens, what I'm about to tell you is crucial for your survival." The director activated a holographic display, showing a creature that made Mark's blood run cold. The hologram showed a massive predator with pitch-black scales that seemed to absorb light. Its 6 legs ended in razor-sharp claws, and its elongated head featured multiple rows of teeth. But what caught Mark's attention were its eyes. They seemed to hold an intelligence that contradicted its fearsome appearance. "This is a shadow claw," Director Blue explained. "The most lethal predator species known to the Federation. They have killed more sentient beings than any other creature in recorded history. We keep one contained in Block X for study." Mark leaned forward, fascinated. "What have we learned about them so far?" "Very little. 3 researchers died trying to study it last year alone. The creature shows no mercy, no emotion, and no capacity for anything except violence." Director Blue's upper hands twitched, a sign of stress. "You are never to approach Block X without express permission and a full security team." The briefing continued with other species Mark would be studying, but his mind kept returning to the shadow claw. Something about the creature's eyes in the hologram bothered him. They didn't look like the eyes of a mindless killer. Later that night, in his new quarters, Mark accessed the station's database. He found security footage of the shadow claw in its containment cell. The creature paced in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Most predators in captivity showed random movement patterns, but this was different. He watched hours of footage, taking notes. The shadow claw appeared to react differently to various researchers who approached its enclosure. It showed more aggression toward those who came armed, and less toward maintenance workers who simply cleaned nearby areas. A notification popped up on his screen. "Block X restricted. Further unauthorized access will be reported." Mark closed the files, but he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was missing something important. The warning about the shadow claw's deadly nature only made him more curious. Why would evolution create a species that simply killed everything it encountered? That wouldn't make sense from a survival standpoint. As he prepared for bed, Mark made a decision. He would follow protocols, of course, but he would also watch, observe, try to understand what others had missed about these creatures. Perhaps being human, being from a species that had evolved alongside predators, gave him a perspective the other aliens lacked. The space station hummed softly around him as he drifted off to sleep, his dreams filled with images of black scales and intelligent eyes that seemed to hold secrets waiting to be discovered. Little did Mark know, in Block X, a pair of those same eyes stared at a security camera, watching, waiting, and perhaps wondering about the new creature that had spent hours studying its movements. 3 weeks after arriving at Research Station Delta, Mark found himself standing outside Block X, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent days preparing for this moment, studying every piece of footage he could access and filing all the proper paperwork. "Dr. Stevens, are you sure about this?" asked Tom, the human security officer assigned to him. The last group that went in there. Well, it wasn't pretty. Mark nodded, checking his tablet one more time. "I've noticed something in the footage. The Shadow Claw responds differently to different approaches. Every researcher who died went in showing fear or carrying weapons." The security door slid open with a soft hiss. Mark had deliberately chosen the early station morning when most aliens were in their rest cycle. He didn't need an audience for what he was about to try. The containment area was massive, with reinforced walls that could withstand a small explosion. The Shadow Claw's enclosure took up most of the space, separated from the observation area by energy fields and transparent barriers that looked stronger than steel. And there it was. The creature was even more impressive in person. Its black scales seemed to drink in the light, creating an outline of darkness against the white walls. It was larger than the hologram had shown, easily twice Mark's height when standing at full length. Those intelligent eyes fixed on him immediately. "Stay behind the first barrier," Tom warned, his hand resting on his stun weapon. Mark stepped forward, but stopped well before the barrier. Then he did something that made Tom gasp. He sat down cross-legged on the floor. The Shadow Claw's head tilted slightly. "I've been watching you," Mark said softly, knowing the creature could hear him through the barrier. "You're not what they think you are you?" The creature moved closer to the barrier, its movement smooth and controlled. No mindless aggression, no charging or attacking. Just careful observation. "Look at that," Mark whispered to Tom. "It's mirroring my calm behavior. This isn't a mindless killer. It's responding to how it's approached." The Shadow Claw did something then that nobody had recorded before. It lowered itself to the ground, matching Mark's sitting position. Its 6 legs folded under it in a way that reminded Mark of a cat settling down. "Dr. Stevens," Tom's voice shook slightly. "What's happening?" "Communication," Mark answered, not taking his eyes off the creature. "It's showing us it understands." Over the next hour, Mark remained seated, occasionally making small, deliberate movements. The Shadow Claw watched each one, sometimes repeating them in its own way. When Mark raised his right hand slowly, the creature lifted its corresponding front leg. When he tilted his head, it did the same. "This is incredible," Mark said, making notes on his tablet. "It's not just mimicking, it's engaging in deliberate exchange. Look how it waits for my next movement. That's not predatory behavior, that's social interaction." The creature made a series of subtle movements with its head and front legs. Mark recorded everything, certain he was witnessing something important. The moment was broken by the sound of the main door opening. Director Blue rushed in, followed by several security officers. "Dr. Stevens, what do you think you're doing?" The director's voice boomed through the room. The Shadow Claw immediately rose to its full height, its posture changing completely. Mark saw how it responded to the director's aggressive tone and threatening presence. "Director, please," Mark said, staying seated and calm. "Look at how it's responding to different approaches. It's not aggressive unless threatened." "This is a violation of protocol," Director Blue snapped. "Security, escort Dr. Stevens out immediately." As the security team approached, Mark saw the Shadow Claw's behavior shift again. It moved closer to the barrier near him, its posture suggesting protection. That's when Mark knew he had been right all along. This creature wasn't just intelligent, it was capable of forming bonds. And somehow, in one short session, he had begun to form one. As he was led out of Block X, Mark looked back one last time. The Shadow Claw watched him leave, and in its eyes, he saw not the galaxy's deadliest predator, but perhaps its most misunderstood species. Mark spent the next week under close supervision, restricted to basic research duties. But he couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen in Block X. Every night, he reviewed his recordings of the Shadow Claw's movements, mapping out patterns that looked more and more like a complex language. "You're obsessed," Tom told him during their lunch break. The security officer had become his only friend on the station. "But I saw it too. The way it matched your movements. That wasn't normal predator behavior." Mark pushed his food around his plate. "I need to go back. There's something there, Tom. A whole way of communicating that everyone's missed because they were too afraid to look. Director Blue will never approve it. Then I won't ask for approval." That night, Mark used his research clearance to enter Block X through a maintenance schedule loophole. The night shift security guard, believing he was doing authorized work, let him in without question. The Shadow Claw was awake, as if it had been waiting for him. Mark sat in the same spot as before, and to his amazement, the creature immediately moved to mirror his position. "Hello again," Mark said softly. "I'm going to call you Shade. Hope you don't mind." He began to repeat some of the movements he had seen Shade make in his recordings. The creature's reaction was immediate. Its eyes widened, and it made a series of quick, precise gestures with its front legs. Mark spent hours recording and mimicking movements, slowly building a basic understanding. Certain patterns seemed to relate to food, others to territory, and some appeared to be greetings. He lost track of time, completely absorbed in what felt like learning a new language. He didn't hear the door open. "What is the meaning of this?" Director Blue's voice cracked like a whip through the room. Mark jumped to his feet, but kept his movements slow and controlled. Shade rose too, but stayed calm, matching Mark's steady movements. "Director, I can explain," Mark started. "Security breach in Block X." Director Blue spoke into his communicator. "Remove Dr. Stevens immediately. Prepare for emergency containment." "Wait." Mark held up his hands. "Look at Shade's behavior. No aggression, no threats. I've been here for hours, communicating." Two alien security officers entered, weapons drawn. The moment they appeared, Shade's posture changed dramatically. The creature moved to position itself between Mark and the armed officers, making a series of sharp warning gestures. "It's protecting me," Mark realized aloud. "Don't you see? Shade is responding to threats, not creating them." "Shade." Director Blue's voice dripped with disgust. "You named the galaxy's deadliest predator. This is worse than I thought. You're mentally compromised." The security officers moved forward, but stopped when Shade let out a low sound that made the walls vibrate. The creature's protective stance became more pronounced. "Everyone stop," Mark said firmly. "Your weapons and aggressive approach are triggering defensive responses. Let me show you what I've learned." He turned to Shade and made a series of careful movements, the patterns he had learned that seemed to mean peace or friendship. The creature immediately relaxed its defensive posture, though it kept watching the armed officers. "Impossible," one of the security officers whispered. Director Blue's four arms crossed tightly. "Dr. Stevens, you are hereby removed from all research duties. You will be confined to quarters until we can arrange your transfer back to Earth." "You can't do this," Mark protested. "We're on the verge of a breakthrough. Shade's species isn't just intelligent. They have a complex language based on movement. Everything we thought we knew about them is wrong." As security moved to escort him out, Mark looked back at Shade. The creature made one final series of movements, a pattern he hadn't seen before. Somehow, he understood its meaning. Return. In his quarters later, under guard, Mark began writing everything down. He had to preserve what he'd learned. Somewhere in his notes was the key to understanding the most misunderstood species in the galaxy, and he had made a promise to return, one way or another. 3 days into his confinement, Mark received an unexpected visitor. Tom entered his quarters, looking nervous but determined. "I spoke with the night shift guards," Tom said, closing the door. "They've been watching the Shadow Claw, Shade. It's been making the same patterns over and over, The ones you showed us. It hasn't eaten since you left. Mark sat up straight. Shade's trying to communicate. Has anyone recorded the movements? Better. Tom placed a data chip on the table. I got you full access to the live security feed. But there's more. I did some digging in the old records, before the Federation labeled shadow claws as deadly predators. Mark quickly connected the chip to his tablet. The screen showed Shade in the containment area, making deliberate movements that Mark now recognized as communication attempts. Look at this, Tom said, pulling up ancient files. The first contact with shadow claws wasn't violent. It only turned bad when colonists started appearing with weapons and capture equipment. Mark studied the historical footage. The early encounters showed shadow claws approaching alien ships with the same careful movements he had seen from Shade. But when the aliens responded with fear and weapons, the creatures became defensive and aggressive. They're a civilization, Mark whispered. Not just intelligent individuals. They have a whole culture based on movement and trust. The Federation got it completely wrong. A soft beep from his tablet drew their attention back to the live feed. Shade was making new movements, more complex than before. Mark grabbed his notebook and started writing frantically. What is it? Tom asked. Shade's not just communicating. She's teaching, Mark explained. These are basic movement patterns, repeated in sequences. Like someone teaching the alphabet. For hours, they watched as Shade demonstrated what appeared to be fundamental elements of shadow claw communication. Mark filled page after page with notes, seeing how simple movements combine to form more complex meanings. The base emotions come first, he explained to Tom. See how she shows trust by lowering her guard. Then threat by rising up. But it's not just about feeling. It's about choice. She's showing that they consciously choose peace or violence based on how others approach them. Tom watched the screen in amazement. That's why they became so dangerous. Everyone approached them as monsters. So they responded as monsters, Mark finished. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But humans, we evolved alongside predators on Earth. We learned to read body language, to understand that big and scary doesn't always mean hostile. Suddenly, the feed showed Director Blue entering Block X with a team of researchers. They carried sampling equipment and restraints. No, Mark breathed. They're going to try to take samples from her. They don't understand. This will destroy all the trust we've built. On screen, Shade rose to her full height as the team approached. Her movements shifted from teaching patterns to warning signals that Mark now understood perfectly. We have to stop them, Mark said, heading for the door. But Tom blocked his way. You're under confinement. If you break it, you'll be sent back to Earth immediately. Mark watched helplessly as the team approached Shade with their equipment. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of attacking, Shade began making the same teaching movements she had shown Mark. She's trying to communicate with them too, Mark realized. Even now, she's choosing to try understanding first. The researchers paused, confused by the creature's unusual behavior. Director Blue pushed forward with the restraints, but some of his team held back, watching the deliberate patterns with growing curiosity. It's starting, Mark said softly. They're beginning to see what I saw. Shade isn't just proving me right. She's teaching them herself. He sat down at his desk and began writing his official report for the Galactic Federation. The truth about shadow claws needed to be documented, and now he had dozens of witnesses to their true nature. The galaxy was about to learn that its most feared predator was actually its most misunderstood teacher. The station's emergency alarms jolted Mark awake at 300 station time. Red warning lights flashed through his quarters as the AI's voice echoed through every corridor. Warning. Critical reactor failure detected. Core containment systems failing. All personnel proceed to emergency evacuation pods immediately. Mark rushed to his door, but the security lock was still active. He was trapped in his quarters while the station faced a meltdown. Through his window, he could see aliens running toward the escape pods, their movements panicked and hurried. His tablet lit up with an incoming call from Tom. "Mark, the reactor cooling system is failing. Something went wrong during routine maintenance." Tom's voice crackled with static. "The whole station could go critical in less than an hour. Can you override my door lock? I need to get out of here." "I'm trying, but the emergency protocols have locked down all security systems." "But that's not the worst part." Tom paused. "They're leaving Shade behind." Director Blue ordered Block X sealed and abandoned. Mark's blood ran cold. "They can't do that. She's a sentient being." "The evacuation protocols don't classify shadow claws as sentient species. They list them as dangerous specimens to be abandoned in emergencies." The station shuddered, and warning messages flashed across Mark's tablet showing critical system failures spreading through the station. Then his security door suddenly slid open. Tom stood there, override device in hand. "I'm breaking about 50 regulations, but I couldn't leave you locked up." "We have to get to Block X," Mark said, already moving. "Are you crazy? The reactor's going to blow." "Exactly. And Shade might be our only hope of stopping it." They ran through the emptying corridors, passing the last few groups heading for escape pods. When they reached Block X, the security doors were sealed with emergency lockdown protocols. "The override won't work on this," Tom said. "These doors are designed to contain shadow claws no matter what." Mark stepped up to the door's window. Inside, he could see Shade pacing, making urgent communication gestures. She knew something was wrong. "Shade," he shouted through the door, "we're going to get you out." Tom checked his tablet. "Mark, we have less than 30 minutes before core breach. The containment field won't survive that kind of explosion." Mark studied the door's control panel. "The emergency protocols are designed to keep Shade in, but they're also designed to protect the station. If the system detects a bigger threat..." He began typing on the panel, using his research clearance to access core systems. "If I can convince the computer that keeping Block X sealed is more dangerous than opening it." Warning messages flashed across the panel as Mark worked. The station shuddered again, more violently this time. Emergency lights flickered. 20 minutes to core breach, the AI announced. Finally, the door's locks disengage. As the barrier slid open, Shade stepped forward carefully, looking at Mark and Tom. "We need your help," Mark said, making the trust gestures he had learned. "The station's reactor is failing. Without repairs, everyone still aboard will die." Shade's response was immediate. She made a series of quick movements that Mark now understood meant agreement and urgency. "She knows about technology," Mark explained to Tom as they ran toward the reactor core. "Shadow claws aren't just intelligent. They're advanced. They understand machines." They reached the reactor control room to find it abandoned, emergency warnings flashing across every screen. The core temperature was rising rapidly. Shade moved to the control panels, her movements precise and deliberate. Her 6 legs allowed her to operate multiple controls simultaneously, and her natural ability to see in darkness let her work even as emergency power began to fail. "Look at that," Tom whispered. "She knows exactly what she's doing." Mark watched in amazement as Shade's claws, which the galaxy feared as weapons, delicately manipulated the reactor's emergency systems. She worked with the speed and precision that only someone with 6 limbs and advanced knowledge could manage. 10 minutes to core breach, the AI announced, but Mark could see the reactor temperature beginning to stabilize. In the darkened control room, human, security officer, and Shadowclaw worked together to save what remained of the station. And somewhere above them, security cameras recorded everything, providing undeniable proof that the galaxy's deadliest predator was anything but mindless. 2 days after the reactor crisis, Mark stood before the Galactic Federation's Emergency Council. The large chamber was filled with representatives from hundreds of species, all gathered to hear about the events on Research Station Delta. Director Blue spoke first, his blue skin slightly pale as he addressed the council. "I must admit that I was wrong about the Shadowclaw specimen. The station's security footage clearly shows it working to save the reactor, displaying not just intelligence but advanced technical knowledge. The head of the council, a tall crystalline being, leaned forward. "Show us this footage." The chamber's massive screens lit up with images from the station's cameras. Everyone watched as Shade worked at the reactor controls, her movements precise and purposeful. The footage then showed earlier recordings of her communication attempts with Mark, the teaching sessions, and the careful way she had tried to reach out to others. "As you can see," Mark said, stepping forward, "Shadowclaws are not just intelligent. They have their own civilization, language, and technical knowledge. The violence we've seen from them has been purely defensive, triggered by our own hostile approaches." Murmurs filled the chamber. A reptilian counselor raised a clawed hand. "If what you say is true, why have they never attempted peaceful contact before?" "They did," Mark replied, nodding to Tom, who brought up the historical records they had found. "The first contacts were peaceful. It was only after we approached them with weapons and capture teams that the relationship became violent. They were responding to our fear with defensive behavior." The screens showed the early encounters, peaceful at first, then turning violent only after aggressive actions from Federation ships. "And where is this Shadowclaw now?" another counselor asked. "Shade is being kept comfortable in a proper guest quarter on Station Delta," Mark answered. "She's been helping us understand their language and culture. With her help, we've already located 3 Shadowclaw settlements in neutral space." The crystalline head counselor's surface flickered with colored lights, their species' way of showing surprise. "You've found their colonies?" "Yes," Mark said. "And they're willing to open diplomatic channels, but only if we approach peacefully. They've already sent a message." He gestured to Tom, who played the recording. The screen showed Shade making a series of careful movements, which Mark translated. "We have waited long for those who would see us as we are, not as their fears painted us." The human named Mark showed us that some can look past appearances to find truth. "We offer peace to those who offer the same." The chamber erupted in discussion. Species that had feared Shadowclaws for generations were being asked to completely change their understanding. "How can we trust this?" someone called out. "They've killed hundreds of our people. And how many of them have we killed out of fear?" Mark countered. "Shade could have let the station be destroyed. Instead, she risked her life to save everyone still aboard, including those who had planned to abandon her." The council chamber grew quiet as this sank in. The head counselor's crystal surface rippled with deep blues and greens, colors of serious thought. "Dr. Stevens," they said finally, "you have shown us that even our most deeply held beliefs can be wrong. The Federation prides itself on seeking truth and understanding. We would be hypocrites to ignore truth simply because it challenges our preconceptions." The counselor rose, crystalline form catching the light. "I propose an immediate diplomatic mission to the Shadowclaw settlements. Dr. Stevens, you and Shade will lead this mission as our primary contact team." Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Months of work, danger, and discovery were finally bearing fruit. "There's one more thing," he added. "We've learned that Shadowclaws have been waiting for a species capable of looking past fear to find understanding. They believe humans might be uniquely suited for this because we evolved alongside predators on Earth, learning to distinguish between actual threats and simple differences." The head counselor's surface flickered with amused lights. "Perhaps this is why the universe brought humans and Shadowclaws together at this moment. Sometimes the newest member of a community can see truth that others have been blind to for generations." As the council chamber filled with excited discussion about the upcoming diplomatic mission, Mark smiled. Somewhere on Station Delta, Shade was probably watching this broadcast, making the Shadowclaw gesture for satisfaction. The galaxy's most feared predator was about to become its newest ally, all because one human had chosen to look past fear and find understanding. 6 months after the historic council meeting, Mark stood on the surface of a planet that few non-Shadowclaws had ever seen. The dark purple sky stretched above him, and twin moons cast long shadows across the landscape. Beside him, Shade moved with the easy grace of someone finally home. "Your world is beautiful," Mark said, making the gesture for appreciation that had become natural to him now. Shade responded with a series of movements that Mark had learned meant "welcome to our beginning." Around them, other shadow claws emerged from structures that blended perfectly with the natural rock formations of their world. The diplomatic mission had exceeded everyone's expectations. Not only had the shadow claws welcomed peaceful contact, but they had also shared technological advances that the Federation had never imagined. Their ability to work in complete darkness had led them to develop energy systems that barely produced heat or light, solving problems that Federation scientists had struggled with for centuries. "The first training group arrives tomorrow," Mark said to Tom, who had become the head of the new human Shadow Claw diplomatic security team. "Are we ready?" Tom nodded, watching as a young Shadow Claw practiced communication gestures with a human diplomat. Still amazing to think that 6 months ago, everyone thought these guys were mindless killers. Now we've got a waiting list of species wanting to learn from them. Mark smiled as he saw Director Blue approach, looking much more comfortable around Shadow Claws than he had months ago. The former station director had become one of the strongest advocates for Shadow Claw integration into the Federation. "The new training facility is ready," Director Blue announced, using a combination of spoken words and Shadow Claw gestures, a new form of communication that was becoming popular throughout the galaxy. "We're calling it the Understanding Academy." A group of Shadow Claw youngsters scampered past, playing what looked like a complex game involving synchronized movements. Some human children from the diplomatic families had already started learning the game, their laughter mixing with the soft sounds Shadow Claws made when amused. "They're adapting so quickly," Tom observed. "Both sides." "That's because both species share something important," Mark explained. "Humans and Shadow Claws both evolved to be adaptable. We survived on our worlds by understanding others, not just fighting them." A signal from orbit indicated that a Federation ship was arriving. But unlike 6 months ago, there was no fear, no weapons charge. The ship landed gracefully in the designated area, and its passengers emerged with expressions of wonder rather than terror. Shade made a gesture that Mark now knew meant growth through change. He replied with the human gesture of a thumbs up, which many Shadow Claws had adopted after learning its meaning. "The galaxy's changing," Director Blue said, watching as new diplomats were greeted by their Shadow Claw hosts, all because one human refused to accept old fears. Mark shook his head. "No, it's changing because both sides were ready for it. Humans might have been the bridge, but Shadow Claws like Shade were trying to reach out for generations. We just finally learned to see it." As the sun set, casting the landscape in beautiful shades of purple and blue, Mark watched humans and Shadow Claws working together to unload the ship. Each species moved in their own way, but they had learned to adapt to each other's styles. Where there had once been fear, there was now curiosity and cooperation. "Ready for tomorrow's class?" Tom asked. "You've got quite a crowd signed up." Mark nodded, making the Shadow Claw gesture for shared future, a movement that Shade had taught him on that first day in Block X, though he hadn't understood its meaning then. The gesture was answered by dozens of Shadow Claws and humans nearby, all moving in perfect synchronization. What had started as one human's attempt to understand had become a movement that was changing the galaxy. As the twin moons rose higher, casting their light over this new beginning, Mark realized that the story of humans and Shadow Claws would be told for generations to come. Not as a tale of predator and prey, but as proof that understanding could overcome any fear and friendship could bridge any difference. In the end, it wasn't about defying expectations. It was about daring to look past them to find the truth that had always been there, waiting to be discovered.